This is Andrew, and this is Keen On, the daily now.tv chat show with some of the world's leading thinkers and writers. Hello, everybody. It is Thursday, February the 15th, 2024. Last month, we had an interesting show with the Italian journalist, the legendary Italian journalist, Marzio Mian. He had a cover piece in last month's Harper's entitled Behind the New Iron Curtain, Caviar Counterculture and the Cult of Stalin Reborn. Marzio Mian spent a couple of months traveling through Russia, talking to ordinary Russians, if there's such a thing as an ordinary Russian. And what he wrote was intriguing on lots of levels that broke some of the conventions about miserable Russians in perpetual opposition to a certain Vladimir Putin. We're back to Russians today, but not Russians within Russia, Russians outside, with my guest, Paul Starobin. He's a very distinguished journalist. He's traveled all over the world, an expert on Russia, and he has a new book out, Putin's Exiles, Their Fight for a Better Russia. And he, in this book, traveled around the world, particularly to bordering states on Russia, to talk to Russians' exiles, Putin's exiles. And Paul is joining us from Massachusetts, in Orleans, Massachusetts, on the Cape Cod. Paul, are there any Putin's exiles on Cape Cod?
It's a good question. None that I have run into.
So, in all seriousness, this book is called Putin's Exiles, Their Fight for a Better Russia. Are there many Russians overseas? When the war in Ukraine broke out initially, there were all sorts of reports in Western media of many young Russians fleeing to Western Europe and to neighboring states, former states of the Soviet Union. What kind of numbers do we have in terms of Putin's exiles of Russians?
About 1 million. I mean, it's difficult, of course, to arrive at the exact number, but I think that seems fair. And they didn't all come at the same time. And two or maybe three major waves starting with the invasion. There were some Russians who escaped or left Putin-controlled Russia before the invasion, and I talked to some of those people as well. But the big numbers certainly starting with the invasion, February 24th, 2022, so nearly 2 years now.
And the conventional narrative is that these tend to be young Russians, liberals, people who were in large cities, who were involved in global style jobs. Is that fair, or is that an inaccuracy?
I would say there's more texture and diversity to the group that we're calling the Putin's exiles. Initially, there were large numbers from Moscow and St. Petersburg, which are the centers of liberal opposition to Putin and just liberal values generally in a Western sense. And so you had a number of tech people also included there because those are centers of the tech industry. But I met lots of people from Siberia, for example. There are a lot of sometimes the further away you get from Moscow, you get people who are unhappy. This is an age-old Russian condition for various reasons with the center, with Moscow, and not all of them young. I mean, yes, a number of them. Some left because they're of military age for conscription, which they wanted to avoid. But I met in Tbilisi, for example, the capital of Georgia, with several television journalists who left, and they were at least in their 50s, probably in their 60s.
In the old days, pre-Soviet days at least, one could be in internal exile within the old Russian Empire. I assume that there's no such thing anymore in Putin's Russia of internal exiles. They all need to be overseas. Is that fair, or are there some exiles internally within Russia itself?
I consider Alexei Navalny to be in internal exile, and there's some other journalists who are less prominent.
Well, he's in jail, Navalny, so it's sort of...
So, okay, when in the 19th century, when Dostoevsky, a bunch of people got, quote-unquote, exiled to Siberia, there were strict limits set around their movements and how far they could go, and I would call that a form of exile. I guess we could debate that. In my book, I say I talk about the traditional form of sort of internal or prison exile, and I do apply that to Navalny, who right now is in an incredibly remote place. It's near the around the Arctic
Right,
Circle
Arctic
region.
penal circle. There are lots.
Yeah,
There were
so
reports of
I
him
would
making
call
a joke in public from this exile.
yes, it's amazing how he's maintained his sense of humor. So I would consider him to be in eternal exile imposed on him as opposed to self-exiled.
I want to come back to Navalny later. The book is called Paul Putin's Exiles.
Hmm.
Does that mean, just as Putin is often characterized as egoist authoritarian, that
Hmm.
these people have left Russia because of Vladimir Putin, because of his system, because of his party, or because of simply the idea of Putin?
I like the word system. I think that um, he cannot just be characterized as an authoritarian leader. He is an authoritarian leader. I think he is of a certain kind of czarist type leader, more quote unquote white, I'm sorry, than red. He does not have the formal title of a czar, of course, but uh, he's the president. He has made this alliance, which is an important alliance with the Russian Orthodox Church. I mean, he has all of the traditional sort of accoutrements of a czar, and it looks like he will be in his position for life, as far as we know. I mean, he's up for quote unquote election in the middle of March. They've already kicked off the only sort of anti war opponent from the ballot. So there's no question that he will be returned to office. So yeah, I look at him in those terms. So Putin's exiles, in that sense, the war intensified their opposition to the Putin system or structure, as you put it, but it can be seen as very much a piece with it.
Putin, for better or worse, of course, has appropriated the mantle of Russian nationalism, gone back
Mm-hmm.
to the Tsars, gone back to many of the issues associated with Tsarist Russia.
Yes.
For his exiles, for his opponents, how do they struggle with the idea of pride in Russia and Russianness, Russian culture, Russian history, and their opposition to Putin himself and his system?
Yeah. Well, I think that's really quite a good question, and then it can play out over a number of different dimensions. But I would say my idea of Russian or Russianness encompasses Russian culture, Russian history. It's a much broader, of course, than the institution of the czar. So, and it certainly encompasses the Russian language, which is so distinctive and separates these people in many ways from everyone who does not speak it, although it's complicated and you do have Russian speaking Ukrainians and so forth who do not see themselves as Russians. But Russians are bonded by traditions, by ties, their music, their humor, their jokes is a certain distinctive Russian humor, their methods of satire. I mean, Putin now is being subject to all kinds of fairly merciless satire by Russians in exile. And I would say it's a very Russian character. So this notion of Russianness embraces a lot of different facets. Putin is Russian of a kind, but so are the people who hate his guts and pray for the day that his train blows up with their help.
Let me revise the question. Um, and I'm using this term from your book, how are Putin's exiles rethinking, rewriting, reorienting the idea of Russianness itself? In some ways, of course, this is history repeating itself back to the Slavophile Westerner debates of the 19th century and the way in
Mm-hmm.
which Westerners, sometimes internal, sometimes exiled, were trying to reinvent what it meant to be a Russian in the 19th or 20th and now in the 21st centuries.
Right. I don't know that the exiles have completely rethought the idea of what it means to be a Russian. I think they've thought quite a bit about what the Russian state, now called the Russian Federation, the successor to the Soviet Union, should look like, should be like. And I think in that respect, they're generally united around the principle that it should be some form of a democratic or constitutional republic, perhaps a parliamentary republic in a European style. Now, Russia nominally today is such a republic, but it's not just on paper, it's not really observed. They want to make it meaningful. So, for example, there are some exiles have sort of carved out a vision of a parliamentary republic that very much scales down the strong presidential system that was incorporated into the Russian Federation at the start of the Federation, which was the collapse of the Soviet Union. Boris Yeltsin as the first president. And some of them think that was a mistake to make such a strong presidential system that Putin subsequently took advantage of. But I would say generally these ideas that are percolating around is to make Russian more of what we think of as a liberal society. There are also people, I talked to a Siberian nationalist. I mean, there are a running theme in much of Russian thought and criticism is that Russia is so large that it's all but ungovernable. I mean, I've had that idea expressed to me actually by somebody who worked for Putin years ago. It's really difficult, but this kind of centralization that has characterized Russian governance is something that I think a lot of Putin's critics and the people I talk to in exile would like to, in some fashion, reform.
Paul, you've noted there's a great deal of ideological, ethnic diversity amongst what you call Putin's exiles. What about when it comes to their narrative, their historical narrative of the last 100 or 200 years? Are they nostalgic for the Soviet Union, nostalgic for Tsarism, nostalgic for the 6 months of democracy in the between the first and the second Russian revolutions, indeed nostalgic for Gorbachev and Yeltsin?
In general, no. I mean, the older ones. I'm thinking now of this television journalism couple I talked to in Tbilisi. Maybe for some of that Gorbachev, Perestroika, and Glasnost, but a lot of the people, and as you accurately noted, are of a younger generation, and so they don't have such strong memories of any of those times, and I just wouldn't characterize their disposition as nostalgic in the sense that they have a form of homesickness, I guess, to translate that word literally. No, I think they're looking more towards the future. Their prevailing attitude is just one of sort of bafflement at one level that Russia is now where Russia is, with Putin so entrenched as this kind of czar-like leader, and some hope, but also, some discouragement about the way things it might go. So, yeah, there's kind of a mix of attitudes there. I don't know that they've engaged in a lot of historical analysis on this question. Perhaps some of the more intellectually minded people have, but I think it's more just the perennial Russian question, what is to be done?
But what is to be done requires some sort of model. In America, or a lot of people come on my show, they want to transform America into Denmark. Do
Good luck.
Putin's exiles, do they look at Denmark or Norway or Sweden or Germany or France or the Gulf states or Singapore? Do they see them as models for Russia reinventing itself in a post-Putin age?
Well, one prominent exile, Mikhail Hodorkovsky, who was the oil oligarch of the 90s, who crossed Putin and got locked up for 9 years. I believe it was 9 years, and then got let out on the condition he wouldn't come back. And he's now based in London. He's in his 60s. His model is something like Switzerland, which has the canton system of sort of federated, somewhat autonomous, but not entirely regions. I mean, that is one model.
Isn't that slightly absurd? Though transforming Russia into Switzerland is even more absurd than transforming the United States into Denmark.
I think it's well, if what we mean is that it'll become kind of a next Switzerland, I agree. But I think what Hodorkovsky means by that is just kind of a structural model in that sense. In other words, do you want a federated republic? Do you want something that's more like the United States, which has the relatively strong presidential system? Do you want a parliamentary republic in a kind of classic way? I guess Germany or France or Great Britain are all iterations of those, proportional representation and so forth. But I don't think that they've necessarily all settled on that model. I mean, their thinking about it is more strategic and tactical in terms of how they can try to take down Putin.
We are speaking with Paul Starobin, the author of an important new book, Putin's Exiles, Their Fight for a Better Russia, most important subject. It's come up before, probably will come up again, the idea of reforming Russia, of making it perhaps more democratic, more inclusive, fairer, more liberal, more just. I want to remind everyone, when it comes to liberalism, that Liberties, a quarterly journal of culture and politics, does a great job covering all sorts of new themes, ideas, debates amongst liberals of one kind or another. Going to run a short video about Liberties, this quarterly journal of culture and politics, which actually does have a lot of stuff from Russia from time to time. And then we'll be back with Paul Starobin to talk more about Putin's exiles. Don't go away, anyone.
Beyond the news, the noise, there is nuance, insight. Liberties is not just a journal of ideas. It's a meteor of intelligent substance. It's the place to be for engaged citizens. Politics, opinion, substance. Liberties is a triumph for freedom of thought. A quarterly of urgency, of cultural exploration, of intellectual delight, of immaculate prose. It's invaluable. Subscribe now or find Liberties at your favorite bookseller.
You can subscribe to Liberties at libertiesjournal.com. You can do a lot worse on that front if you want to subscribe to an excellent new journal, Liberties Quarterly. We're speaking with Paul Starobin, the author of Putin's Exiles, Their Fight for a Better Russia. In the first half, Paul, you mentioned a couple of the oligarchs who have turned into major, perhaps powerful Putin critics and exiles, particularly in towns like London. How united are Putin's exiles? How many, particularly young liberals, find ex-oligarchs or exiled oligarchs to be just as reprehensible as Putin himself and his secret policemen?
Not that united. I mean, this has been, generally speaking, the curse of Russian exile-dom. I mean, probably the best historical example apparel would be the so-called white Russians loyal to the Tsar, who left Russia after the Russian Revolution. Lenin, Bolsheviks murdered the Tsar. They got out, and then they, spent most of their days in various places just mourning the loss of the Tsar, wishing for his return, but smaller and smaller fractions and fragments. There's some danger of that happening now, I believe, and it's unfortunate. But it's a question of egos to some degree, different agendas. I mean, we can get into the Navalny group if you'd like, but there hasn't been a lot of cooperation, practically speaking.
We've mentioned Navalny a couple of times. The news today is that Russia has issued a warrant for two of his lawyers. He appears from time to time. He's now in the Arctic Circle. He appeared last month smiling. Mm-hmm. He seems, of course, on one level to be an incredibly brave man. How significant is he in your mind? And how do Putin's exiles think of him? Is he the guy, for many, particularly young exiles, if Putin is overthrown?
Yes, I think he's the guy. Number one, more than anyone else, for different reasons. One is he has some charisma. There are critics, liberal critics. There used to be more of them who saw him in sort of crude, as a somewhat crude populist or nationalist type. and there was reason that they would see him that way. But he, I think, proved to be the most powerful of the opposition leaders, and uniquely was able to organize inside of Russia while he was still free in Russia before the poisoning. The certainly looks like an attempted assassination attempt by the Russian security services, and retains to some degree, his organization does, from outside of Russia, some level of organization inside of Russia. And I don't think there's any other exile leader that can claim that.
Are there any historical equivalents? You've talked about the civil war in Russia after the revolution between whites and reds. Is Navalny in some ways a symbol of the best of white Russia, perhaps?
No, I wouldn't call him white Russia, because to me that associates him with the czar. But there is an interesting strain of that Navalny represents that I think is worth talking about, because I think many people, perhaps many of your listeners, have this idea of the opposition and the exiles in Europe and other places as being distinctly secular in nature and mind, and that's not altogether true. So Navalny's saga illustrates that. He was once, by his telling, not a believer at all, and neither were most of the people in his immediate organization. After he was this attempted assassination, he went to Germany, and I have not talked directly to Navalny, but I've talked to people who are very close friends of his, and one of them told me that he kind of became uh, converted as to sort of a Christian gospel way of thinking or believing, not the formal, the Orthodox Church, but something more basic than that. And then when he was brought back to Moscow for trial, various financial charges, basically, he declared himself to be a Christian. I am a Christian. And it's a way, I take that sincerely. I think that he is trying to identify with a certain strain in Russia that thinks along the same lines. And there is a tradition of persecution, of course, of Christians. And so he has this saga. He's almost like a living martyr. And it is a kind of Christian parable, if you will. He's in the lion's den, and so Putin is the lion. And I think that very cleverly, in some ways, situates him well with the Russian people, because they also can identify sometimes with this feeling of helplessness or powerlessness. So his coming back to Russia, which he didn't have to do, after this attempted assassination, was a very powerful kind of physical act. And in some way, as he would have it, he embodies Russia. So you asked before about Russianness, Putin. I would say Navalny and Putin are both, in a way, embodiments of Russia, although in very different ways.
In very different ways, perhaps, but also perhaps in other similar ways. It sounds to me as if he's positioning himself as a kind of Solzhenitsyn for the 21st century, which might be very noble and heroic. He's clearly a remarkably brave man, although I think some people watching or listening might think to themselves, I don't want to be in a state governed by Solzhenitsyn, particularly some of his religious views.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't push that too far, because Solzhenitsyn, Solzhenitsyn came from a quote-unquote white Cossacks type family, and certainly was a believer, and I think is sometimes misunderstood. His great objection to the Soviet Union was its godlessness, his attempted, its outright repression of belief and believers. And not to digress, but Cancer Ward, some of his maybe lesser known books are really all about that. So then he goes into exile in Vermont. But he's also, I think, more than Navalny, a Russian, a chauvinist. I mean, when Solzhenitsyn came back from exile, it was at the collapse of the Soviet Union, and then some years ticked by. But he wrote this tract that basically outlined this notion of a greater Russia, which in some ways is not all that different from what Putin has kind of adumbrated in his own uh, articles and historical disquisitions about how Ukrainians are not really Ukrainians, they're Russians. I don't think Solzhenitsyn would say that exactly. And I also don't think he would believe, I know he wouldn't believe because he said so, in a forcible sort of incorporation of Ukraine into Russia. But he identified Ukraine, Belarus, and northern Kazakhstan with a lot of Russians as part of this sort of greater Russian. I have not heard of Navalny speaking quite some those terms. So they're both dissidents, but I don't think that they belong in the same categories exactly.
When I was younger, Paul, I was a big fan of some of the work of Richard Pipes, one of America's great historians of Russia. He
Yeah,
wrote
me
two
too.
books on a man called Struve, liberal on the left and then liberal on the right. If we're to think about Putin's exiles, are there Struvers around? Old aristocrats who are liberals as well, perhaps the sort of men, they tend to be men, although perhaps women, who might have been comfortable in the provisional government?
Interesting question. I hadn't quite thought about that. I don't think I met any types that I would call exactly aristocratic. I did meet an interesting fellow actually I jokingly said there were no exiles that I was aware of in Cape Cod, but I did meet with one of Navalny's sort of chief. He's kind of a fundraiser type. He's certainly loyal to Navalny in a suburb of Boston, Brookline, and he had sort of set up his a little corner of his mansion in Brookline, and it was a mansion, as a kind of chapel or shrine to Navalny. There were all these like covers of magazines with Navalny's face on it, and we talked, and he offered me a bowl of chocolates that that came from Moscow, chocolata. It was I had a little bit of that kind of feeling of some of the exiles are almost like they're still living in Russia. That's their mindset. So when you're served the chocolates from Moscow, and I'm sure there must have been green tea or something like that maybe also came from there. So yeah, Nabokov is sort of an interesting figure as well, because he was in exile for many, many years, and he wrote quite a great deal about it. And not exactly an aristocrat, but if you remember, his father was an important politician. He was assassinated in Germany, and so digressing, but all these kind of murderous stories that are associated with Russians in exile, this has been going on for centuries.
Paul, again, some people might be listening to this and thinking, who are we as Americans, particularly given the state of America, to be interfering in Russia, playing up Putin's exiles? Most Western observers of Russia over the last couple of 100 or 300 years have done a particularly poor job picking out virtuous people who might replace one kind of tyrant or another. Should we be careful fetishizing Putin's exiles, playing them up, making them into heroes?
I'm certainly not fetishizing them. That's a word that evokes a kind of worship of a inordinate degree.
Well,
no.
but the title of your book is Putin's Exiles, Their Fight for a Better Russia. It assumes that his exiles are good people and that that Putin is bad.
Well, I think it's a good fight. They may not all be good people. I mean, people are complicated, but I think the question of which side you're on is a fair question, and one that I entertain. And I think their fight is a good fight for reasons I've described, because I think that Putin represents something that is objectively, or if not objectively, in my own assessment, and I met him 25 or so years ago, just before he became president, something that has been pretty bad for Russia. So, yeah, but I don't fetishize them as being like saints or something like that. That would be the wrong idea. I mean, they're complicated people. Many of them feel quite guilty about what they've done or not done, often in the sense that they didn't do enough to oppose Putin, which is also a distinctly Russian theme, right? I mean, this notion of guilt, of communal guilt or shame. We find that in Dostoevsky from Crime and Punishment, or the brothers Karamazov. So, they're mixed in their characters, and I'm sure if you talk to them, they would not necessarily describe themselves as good people or even heroic people.
As I mentioned last month, we had the Italian journalist Marzio Mian. I'm not sure if you saw his piece
I
behind
did
Blue Line.
actually. I saw it. Somebody, a friend of mine in Russia, flagged it
Yeah,
for
it's an
me. I thought it was
interesting piece
interesting.
because one of the interesting pieces, in contrast, I guess, to your work, is that
Mhm.
he reports on people who aren't necessarily in opposition
Mhm. Mhm.
to Putin, and
Yeah.
just as we tend to, perhaps rather than fetishize, we in the West tend to orientalize, to use another word, Russia, and imagine it this terrible place. What Mian
Yeah.
found was a fairly normal place full of decent restaurants and people
Yeah.
who were reasonably contented, not unhappy, even with the war in Ukraine. What would you say to people like that?
Well, we have to unpack quite a bit there uh, in what you just said. So, yeah, I mean, I've probably been. I'm not sure, can't remember exactly where he didn't he like travel down the Volga? Was that
Yeah,
his?
yeah.
So yeah, I've been down to some of those areas like Samara, for example. I've been as far to the northeast as Chukotka, which is, from where you can practically see Alaska. I've been to Khabarovsk, which is on the border from crossing a river from China. I've been to the Caucasus region, Chechnya. I've been all the way up to Murmansk and Pskov and all over Russia, Western Siberia, the oil fields. So yeah, of course. I mean, well, I don't know. Nobody's orientalizing the Russians, or at least they shouldn't. I think that's a very old and discredited habit. It's not that I view them as exotic. My wife is a native Russian speaker. She's from Tashkent in Uzbekistan, and she can quote Pushkin, but she cannot really speak Uzbek. So of course, they come in great varieties. I mean, they're not flavors of ketchup or something, but they're very varied. The men, the women, the old, the young. There are lots of great restaurants in all over Russia that I've certainly. I would agree with a lot of that interpretation. But as far as their attitudes on Putin and the war, though, I think that's kind of complicated. I mean, it's difficult to know exactly because, first of all, how well can you trust a public opinion survey when it is a criminal offense to call the war a war? And people, this is not just like an abstract thing. I mean, people are getting locked up. They just locked up the Boris Kargalitsky, the sociologist, who's a wonderful critic of Russia and Putin in a good way, for 5 years for just some kind of sort of nonsense type slightly perhaps inflammatory phrase that he made. So people are scared. I don't know what, you know, the Italian journalist, how much he encountered that, but you have to be careful about who you talk to and what you say. There are absolutely Putin supporters. I've talked to many of them. I've been talking to them for 25 years. Some people think Russia needs a strong man, a silny человек, and Putin represents that because, as I mentioned earlier, Russia's so big, they fear the forces of disorder if they don't have that strong man. But you also have plenty of people, I think, who are pretty, they're not too happy with Moscow. I mean, that's an old theme in Russia as well. The further that you get from the center, you've got mothers now who are upset that their mothers and wives are upset that their sons and their husbands have been in deployment on the front lines in Ukraine for so long and are not getting separated. You have non-ethnic Russian peoples. I read this journal from the Lake Baikal region in Siberia, which all these, the conscripts generally are coming from these out of the way areas where their people are being paid by the government substantial bonuses to sign up for the war and death benefits, to the family if they're killed. That to me does not suggest, a war that is terribly popular. So I would say, yeah, it's a very mixed picture inside of Russia. I haven't been there since the war started.
I assuming you're not. Would you get a visa if you applied? Would you be free to go there?
So my initial idea for this book was something like Inside of Russia Beyond the Cliches, because there are quite a number of cliches, and it's always
So sort of
interesting.
like on the Mian
Well,
model behind the new Iron Curtain, although you might have written different sorts of things.
yeah, I'm not so sure about the cult of Stalin. I
Well,
don't know.
I mean, he wasn't imagining it. He found a cult of Stalin.
Yeah. No. Well, look, Russia has 145 odd million people. I have no doubt among some of them there is the cult of Stalin. I could also in Russia easily in Siberia find all kinds of anarchists and people who would despise anything about Stalin. There are also these raging religious style nationalists who are glad that Russia is now being cleansed of this liberal scum, as Putin calls them. There are dissident priests in the Orthodox Church. I spoke to one of them in exile in Batumi, and I'm told, and I think it's true, that there are other priests in Russia now who are not particularly happy. They're not happy at all with what Putin has done or what the patriarch Kirill has said, and the bishops have been largely quiet or supportive of the war. There are such people who are opposed. I don't, I can't improve on Dostoevsky then in this regard. I mean, his whole picture of Russia is how the Russians are frequently kind of at war, spiritually and, rhetorically speaking with each other, sometimes at the point of the gun. So it's a very varied place. But long story made short, I did put in for my visa. This was before the war. I mean, they know who I am. I used a person who I always use when I need the visa. I went to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs because I wanted them to understand I'm a journalist. It's a project. It's a book project and so forth. It was never acted on. So I took that as a no. I pursued it as much as I could, to the highest levels possible, but there was never an answer. So I just took that as a no.
Probably a compliment in some ways.
I don't know. I mean, what can one say?
Congratulations, Paul, on that front.
Yeah.
And of course, you're absolutely right. It's always very hard to improve on Dostoevsky. I wonder if Donald Trump is elected in November, whether someone, maybe even a Russian journalist, will write a book about Trump's exiles, their fight for a better America. Putin recently came out with an argument. I'm not sure how seriously people are taking it in terms of the interview he did, was that he preferred Biden over Trump. What's your analysis of Putin's power? We've been told for years that he's dying. We've been told for years there's huge internal opposition. He's going to get overthrown by some military coup of one kind or another. What's your sense of Putin's security or lack of security in terms of his power in Russia?
There's no history in Russia of military-inspired coups, really. Even in the Prigozhin mutiny, as such as it was last year. I mean,
he of course died in a plane crash in August of last year.
Right, and as they say, suspicious circumstances. But he was like kind of a warlord. I mean, he had been Putin's caterer and so forth. He wasn't, a classic general type. So I don't expect the generals to go after Putin. I think if it came, it would probably come from elsewhere in the sort of security services, the so-called Siloviki, the men of power, as they are called, of which Putin is one of their numbers. But I haven't, again, really difficult to detect, but I haven't detected that, there's some imminent uprising. I think we'll have to wait until after Putin's death. I have no intelligence about his
health.
Will
he ever die, Paul? Can you confirm that? Putin? It doesn't seem as if he seems indestructible.
Well, there's some interesting, I wrote years ago a profile on Putin, and I talked to somebody at the Naval Connected, let's just say, to the Navy and America, who did some interesting research indicating that he had some kind of a stroke, possibly. If you notice in childhood, the way he walks, he sometimes seems to drag one of his feet, and his arm seems to be kind of stiff. But I watched this interview with Tucker Carlson, and he looked fine to me.
Yeah, he looks better than Tucker Carlson, which isn't saying much. Right?
He looks fine. So I don't know. He's 71 years old, but yes, of course he's going to die at some point. I understand.
Are you sure? Can you confirm that, Paul?
No, I guess I really can't confirm that.
He might live forever. And finally, when he does die, which I think probably most people here won't necessarily mourn him, is he going to have Mussolini's fate and get strung up, or is he going to have Lenin's fate and get a mausoleum?
I don't see. Well, it would all depend if
it obviously all depends, but speculate.
Well, okay. So when Stalin died, and not that I see the exact equivalence, there was this vicious scrum for power, and we weren't sure who was going to end up on top. And I think something like that could well happen with Putin, and that would be the best chance that these exiles or the Navalny forces, would have. So that would be my sense of things, that there would be a vacuum, and it would be very, very unpleasant as far as the infighting to fill that vacuum. And we probably don't know the person right now as we're speaking who would come after him.
Well, if there are any movie makers out there, was a wonderful film called Death of Stalin. Maybe they can work on a film, Death of Putin.